All right, let's dive in. Today, we are tackling something called gastric polyps. Now, these are actually surprisingly common growths that show up in the stomach lining, but they're often really misunderstood. We're going to break down exactly what they are and, what they really mean. So, picture this. Maybe you or someone you know has heard those words from a doctor. We found a stomach polyp. It can feel, a little vague, maybe even a bit scary. So what is a stomach polyp really? What's causing it? And the big question, right? What does it mean for your health? That is exactly what we're going to get into. And here's our game plan. We're going to tackle this in 5 parts. First, we'll look at polyps that are caused by simple inflammation. Then we'll get into the ones linked to medications and even our genes. After that, a really important one, adenomas, which are a kind of cancer warning. We'll touch on some specific genetic syndromes, and then we'll wrap it all up by looking at how doctors figure this all out under the microscope. Okay, so let's start with the most common reason these things pop up. These are polyps that don't just appear out of thin air. They're the end result of the stomach being irritated for a really long time. The main character in this story is something called a hyperplastic polyp. And its origin story, more often than not, starts with a specific bug. Helicobacter pylori. You might have heard of it as H. pylori. This little bacterium can cause this long-term simmering inflammation that leads to a condition called atrophic gastritis. And all that really means is that the stomach's protective lining starts to get worn down and damaged. So how does this actually work? Well, it's pretty much a chain reaction. The H. pylori infection kicks off this chronic inflammation. The body fights back by producing more of a hormone called gastrin, which is basically a signal that tells stomach cells to grow and repair. But with the infection sticking around, that growth signal gets stuck in the on position. And that overstimulation, that constant command to proliferate, causes cells to just pile up and form a hyperplastic polyp. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and frankly, pretty serious. A long-term H. pylori infection can actually cause the stomach lining to change so much that it starts to look and act like the lining of your intestines. It's a condition called intestinal metaplasia. And just that one change, that alone, can increase the risk of gastric cancer by up to 10 times. It's a huge deal. So what about the hyperplastic polyp itself? Is it cancer? Well, here's the good news. The risk of one of these actually becoming cancerous is very, very low. But it's not zero. The risk does go up with certain factors, right? Things like being older, having bigger or just more polyps, their specific shape, and of course, if that pesky H. pylori is still hanging around. All right, let's switch gears to our next category. And this one has this fascinating duality to it. We're talking about a single type of polyp, the fundic gland polyp, but it can be caused by 2 totally different things. So check this out. On one hand, you can get these polyps from the long-term use of super common acid-reducing heartburn meds called PPIs. On the other hand, you can get the exact same polyp from a rare genetic syndrome you're born with called FAP. What's so wild is that both of these paths, a common medication and a rare genetic condition, end up doing the same thing at the cellular level. They cause a pileup of a protein called beta-catenin, which basically screams at the cells to just keep growing and growing. Okay, now we need to shift our focus to a much more serious category. If the other polyps we've talked about are kind of a yellow light, well, adenomas are a flashing red one. These are considered precancerous, and they always demand close attention. And you're going to notice a theme here. Just like the others, adenomas don't disappear in a perfectly healthy stomach. They're almost always found in a stomach lining that is already beaten up from chronic inflammation, from that same intestinal metaplasia and thinning of the lining that we talked about before. An adenoma is a sign that long-term damage is starting to take a really dangerous turn. That same environment of chronic gastritis can actually lead to a totally different type of growth, a neuroendocrine tumor. And again, it's that same hormone, gastrin, that's overstimulating cell growth. It's just targeting a different type of cell this time. And these tumors come in a few different flavors, with some being way more aggressive than others. So far, we've mostly talked about polyps that develop over time because of things like infections or medications. But for some people, the risk is hardwired right into their DNA from the day they're born, through some rare genetic syndromes that have really significant consequences. Syndromes like Peutz-Jeghers or Cowden syndrome, they're caused by inherited mutations in these critical tumor suppressor genes. Now, these genes are supposed to act like the brakes on cell growth. So when you're born with faulty brakes, you can develop polyps all over your digestive system, and you face a much higher risk of cancer over your lifetime. And that means you need incredibly careful and consistent monitoring.
So this all brings us to the most crucial part of the entire story. With all these different kinds of polyps, right, ranging from mostly harmless to actively dangerous, how in the world does a doctor know what they're looking at during a scope? Well, the answer lies in the biopsy. And this quote from the source material just says it all. Histologic evaluation, that is the key. It's a fancy way of saying you have to take a tiny piece of that tissue and look at its cells under a microscope. You just can't get the full story by looking at a polyp with a camera.
And that's because, and this is the crazy part, so many of these different growths can look identical to the naked eye. A totally benign tumor could look exactly like a potentially cancerous one. They're both just little bumps on the stomach lining. So, how does a pathologist solve the mystery?
Well, this is where the detective work comes in. They use these special chemical stains that act like molecular highlighters. So, for example, a GIST, which is a potentially cancerous tumor, will light up positive for a marker called c-KIT. But a benign muscle tumor, a leiomyoma, won't. It'll light up for a different marker called desmin instead. And a schwannoma, a nerve tumor, that lights up for S100. It's this beautiful, precise science that finally reveals the growth's true identity. All of this, the different causes, all the risk factors, the amazing lab tests, it all points to one central, absolutely crucial idea. And it's as simple as this. Not all polyps are created equal. Hearing you have a stomach polyp, that's just the first sentence of the story. The rest of the story, the part that truly matters for your health, is written by the pathologist who figures out exactly what kind of growth it is. Understanding this whole complex landscape of inflammation, medication, and our own genetics, it leaves us with a final, really important question. If our cells have so many different ways that can go wrong, what does the future of truly personalized cancer prevention actually look like? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.